Turn for a moment, if you would, to chapter 4 in 1 Thessalonians. I want you to see what Paul says there about the love that the Thessalonians had for their fellow believers. Reading from 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 9 and 10. Now, as to the love of the brethren, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to love one another. For indeed you do practice it towards all the brethren who are in all Macedonia. But we urge you, brethren, to excel still more. You notice where the Thessalonians' love for the brethren came from? Paul says it was God who was teaching them to love one another, and yet Paul commands the Thessalonians to excel still more. So we see once again that although God is the one producing the attribute of love in these believers, they were still responsible to exert effort in the living out of that love towards one another. They were to excel still more in their labor of love. And to be clear, when Paul refers to the labor of love, he's not talking about a love for the labor itself. I love to teach. I love to counsel. But if my love for those tasks is not subservient to my love for God and my love for His people, then there's a big problem. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 4, if I speak with the tongue of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Paul says that incredible works, amazing works that aren't motivated by love are worthless. Worse, they make us a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal, something irritating and repulsive. Why? Because if my primary motivation is not love for God and love for His people, then by default my labor will be motivated by love of self. My desire to show off my talents, to be recognized and affirmed by others, to ensure that things get done my way. Instead of serving the interests of God and others, I will be serving my own interest, using the church as a platform for exalting myself. And today, the internet and the rise of social media has provided a more public platform for such things. One example is the number of self-appointed theologians and teachers who, without endorsement from or accountability to the local church, love to debate doctrine online. I'm sure many of you have seen such posts. Usually don't have to read very far before it becomes apparent through their provocative statements and snarky retorts, self-righteous condemnation of others, that they're not motivated by a love for God and His people, but a desire to win the argument, to show off their wit, their intellectual prowess, and feel respected and affirmed by gaining more followers, all for their own glory at the detriment of others. Those sorts of motivations have nothing to do with Christ-likeness. And I warn you to stay away from such activities, just as Paul warned Titus and Timothy 6 times in his letters to them not to engage in pointless debates that only lead to strife. In 2 Timothy 2:14, Paul tells Timothy, solemnly charge them in the presence of God not to wrangle about words, which is useless and leads to the ruin of the hearers. And he repeats the warning a few verses later, saying, "But refuse foolish and ignorant speculations, knowing that they produce quarrels. The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome." His warning was even stronger in his letter to Titus in chapter 3, verses 9 through 11. "But avoid foolish controversies and genealogies and strifes and disputes about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. Reject a factious man after a first and second warning, knowing that such a man is perverted and is sinning, being self-condemned." When our actions are not motivated by a love for God or His people, what we do under the guise of Christian ministry becomes destructive rather than beneficial. Which is why we want people first to commit themselves to the local body in membership before allowing them to serve in the church. We want to know as best as we humanly can that they genuinely love God and love His people here at CMC before entrusting them with service to others, both for their own good and for the good of the church. Love for God and love for His people needs to be the reason why we serve in the church, if it's going to be honoring to God and a blessing to others. The labor of love that Paul speaks of is not selfish, but selfless. It does not give in order to get, but sacrifices willingly, joyfully for the benefit of others. The reason that we are to labor at loving others is not so they will love us back. If being loved in return is our motive, then Jesus warns in Matthew 5:46 that we're acting like unbelievers. Pagans do that. Instead, we are to love others in a way that points them to loving Christ. Now, that's not to say that such labor of love has no reward for the one doing the loving. It most certainly does, but neither the motive nor the goal of such love is self-gain, but rather the glory of Christ and the welfare of His people. Now, let's be frank. Each of us has people who we find hard to love. I know I can be hard to love. Just ask my family. And at the same time, I can find it hard to love others as well. So again, let me remind us that as with our work of faith, our labor of love must not be attempted in our own strength. Christ teaches us how to love, really love other people through His example of love for us, which then we pour out to other people. Again, let me ask you, are there ways in which you are sacrificially loving others, seeking nothing for yourself, but only the joy of being a faithful servant of Christ in His people? And again, if not, why not? What's inhibiting you from loving others with the love that Christ has shown to you? As we examine ourselves, I'm sure that each one of us can think of times where love of self has gotten in the way of loving God and loving other people. So there's room here for all of us to grow in and to encourage one another in. As we said before, when these attributes are present, then they are an assurance that we truly are in Christ. As 1 John 13:8 tells us, "Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. We will know by this that we are of the truth and will assure our heart before Him."